Giving the panel your due attention, and I'll turn it over to Shawn.
All right, so I just found out that I'm emceeing this whole show, but we are going to be talking today about we're raising the amount of roofs, and Leah Bradley, she's the CEO from the Central Massachusetts Housing Alliance, is going to be moderating the discussion. Leah.
Thank you. It's great to be here and really glad that you all are talking about affordable housing. It's really what we do at Central Mass Housing Alliance. So just to give you a little bit of background about what Central Mass Housing Alliance does. So we're the planning body for homeless services for Worcester County. A lot of what that means is that we collect data, we follow trends, and really looking at, how is affordable housing impacting homelessness in the area. And so I'll share with you, we also do direct services. We do direct rental assistance to families who are behind on their rent for a variety of reasons, and we provide family shelter services. So I just want to share with you, just to set the stage of what we're seeing with our data. So we're just seeing a significant rise in homelessness here in Worcester County, but I know it's happening across the nation as well. And that's with individuals, so folks who do not have children in their household. We saw a 30% increase year over year, and we know that a lot of that is because rents are rising, their food costs are going up, and there's a lot of impacts to households. We're also in Massachusetts in a family housing crisis. So we have about 5,500 families that are currently in shelter across the state, and they're receiving probably 100 more referrals every day. There is a small portion of that is due to the humanitarian crisis, but the majority of the folks that are in our family shelters are folks that live and work here and really just can't afford rent. So part of what and I will share with you also, the Worcester Research Bureau has also done the report that says that the folks who are cost burdened, so that the income of folks who are cost burdened for rent is really significantly increasing. So it's now at $75,000, where prior to this it was $35,000 a year. So we have multiple folks that are competing for the same limited number of housing units. So one of the things that we really try to do is to figure out how do we work with communities and how do we help increase affordable housing. So we're working with a number of the communities to not only address the homelessness crisis. We're seeing that the crisis for homelessness, especially individual homelessness, is also impacting smaller communities. One of the smaller towns here, I think it's about a 10,000 population, went from 2 unsheltered folks to 22 over a one-year span. Doesn't sound like a lot, but if you think about that one town, it's really an increase. So what we're seeing is that affordable housing just isn't getting built fast enough. And so we really need to figure out, once we build the affordable housing, is what will happen is that we'll see less homelessness. If folks could afford rent, then we wouldn't see homelessness. And so for communities that are seeing a low vacancy rate and a high median rent, you're at most risk of increasing the homeless population. Those are the 2 key indicators that we see. So today, what we wanted to do is to have some panelists here to talk about some of the policy initiatives. What we are seeing is that the communities, there are some acceptance issues that we're having in a lot of communities. And so, how do we help to incentivize, especially some of the smaller communities, and really increasing the affordable housing? What we also know is that if families are able to stay in their community of origin, they're homeless for a shorter period of time. And that's because the children are in the school, they have with their resources and community supports. And so really just thinking about, how does each community increase their affordable housing to be able to help us with this homelessness crisis. And so we do have our panelists here. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and each of them is going to introduce themselves and then talk for a few minutes about some of the policy initiatives that are happening. And if you want to see their bios, it is in the manual that you received. So you can, and in the interest of time, we're going to let folks introduce themselves, and you can read the bios in the manual. Great. I'm going to start off with Chris.
Hi there. Thank you so much. It's so great to be here. I have a PowerPoint, which hopefully will come up. My name is Chris Kluchman. I'm a Deputy Director in the Community Services Division of the new Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities. When Eric asked for my title, I was like, oh, it's so long. What's exciting in Massachusetts is that the Healey-Driscoll administration has emphasized housing. Our agency used to be kind of a sub-agency, and we are now a cabinet-level position. And we have a new name. So if I say DHCD by mistake, please excuse me, because we're now the Housing and Livable Communities, or HLC. Let's just go to the next slide. So I want to talk, and so what I think about all the time is I am not in the emergency assistance side, the folks that work with Leah, but I think about how do we get communities to produce new housing. And so some of that comes through zoning reform, which got, statewide zoning reform. And Massachusetts had statewide zoning reform successfully adopted by the legislature and actually signed by our last governor, Governor Baker. In fact, it was Governor Baker's initiative to begin with. So he, as a moderate Republican, started this, and now the Healey-Driscoll administration continues to implement it. So I'm very proud of what Massachusetts has done, and when I speak in Massachusetts to Massachusetts communities, I don't make this point too loudly, but honestly, this is among the top 7 zoning reforms in the country. Us, California, Minnesota, Colorado, Maryland, and Maine, and some of our other New England states are working on this. And so I'm very proud, and I think it is important legislation. So one of the main things that we see in the problems in producing new housing units, and that's in my mind, other than there's rental assistance and there's federal money that are going for lots of programs. The homeless crisis is a crisis, but one place that it starts is that we're not producing enough housing. Why aren't we producing enough housing? Because in Massachusetts, we have 351 cities and towns. They're all the local zoning authorities. They all have the authority to say what gets built in their community, and unfortunately, more likely, what does not get built. Exclusionary zoning, not allowing for multifamily housing has been pretty endemic in Massachusetts, and so we're looking to change that. I'm going to be talking about something that's generally known as the MBTA Communities Act. It's actually part of zoning reform that also included other reforms to our zoning act, but I'm going to focus on this one, which applies to 177 municipalities and requires that they they have zoning that would allow for multifamily housing. Can you stay on that slide for a second? So I did this because the circle shows Worcester, and so Worcester is where we are now, but this applies to 177 communities throughout Massachusetts. And it's essentially half of the state's municipalities, but in eastern Massachusetts, which is where, kind of the general greater Boston area, but it also extends out to Worcester. The colors here are showing different category types that we developed in developing the program with different requirements, and these are reflecting different kinds of transit assets. So in inner core Boston, we have rapid transit, and anybody who came into Boston Logan, I'm sorry, first of all, and but you may have taken a silver line or the red line or the green line. Those are rapid transits, and so that's the inner core is the rapid transit communities. And then we have commuter rail communities, which extend out. Commuter rail goes here to Worcester, to Union Station. And then we have communities that are adjacent. That means they're a short drive to a commuter rail station. And then we even made an adjacent small town, because we do have communities in Massachusetts that are very small, and they kind of need a little bit different treatment. Okay, next slide. This is, and again, I'm not going to try and cover all of the details of the law. I just wanted to kind of introduce, this is where what I spend part of my time doing and my staff does, is getting communities to think about multifamily zoning. And so one of the things that we've done is we've created multiple steps along the way. The legislation was actually signed in January 2021, and we've had a couple different deadlines requiring communities to do kind of a little bit more and a little bit more. We had a really large deadline this January where we asked communities to say, tell us about the zoning you think you're going to develop, and tell us the timeline that's going to get you there to meet the deadlines that we have set for compliance with the law. And those community categories have different deadlines. We basically have said that the rapid transit communities have to act first and fastest, and and et cetera, with the adjacent small towns, the lowest. So that was great. We had 98% of the 177 communities say, I'm going to step up to the plate, I'm going to file what you asked me to file, and we're going to start having community conversations about multifamily zoning in our community. We have unleashed lots and lots of technical assistance with consultants and funding for consultants to communities. I think we've done over $2 million, and we have over 100 of the 177 communities actively engaged with consultants or their regional planning agency to get the work done. So, just a couple takeaways to leave you with. Again, this legislation is focused on removing zoning barriers. It doesn't require communities to build housing, but one of the things that local governments do is they may say, you need an acre to develop a single unit of housing. And so those kind of more rural and suburban communities need to actually add multifamily zoning to their zoning bylaws. They may not have any of it, or they may have some multifamily zoning, but it's already built and they don't have anything else. There's no more capacity for zoning. Technical assistance I talked about, we've been very bullish on that. I'm very lucky to be working in a time when government has money, and during COVID we've had more money than we kind of knew what to do with. The legislature and the both administrations have stepped up to the plate and are making funding available for this. The context matters. Like I said, we have 177 communities. They're all totally different. They have different housing markets. They have different housing options. They have different transportation access. They all are near transit or have transit assets, but a small town is really different from the city of Worcester, and so we take that into account. And then finally, we're working really hard to tell the story. Ironically, to you guys, we focus a little less on data and a little bit more on making the case for why it is important, why there is a moral imperative to build more, or to zone for more housing and build more housing to house the residents of Massachusetts. I've put this is the law that created this program. It's only 3 paragraphs. I'm not going to read it. I don't want you guys to read it, but in case you are interested, I put it in the slide. This got inserted into our Zoning Act, and again, that's a pretty simple way to say, hey, if you have transit, you should have multifamily zoning. I'm really looking forward to the question and answer session, and while I say that we are leading with making the case instead of data, we are going to produce a ton of data, which I hope I'll get to in the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I wanted to just from our perspective as well, the state having a law that's really looking at how to implement affordable housing in those communities is just really critical for us to get some of the community acceptance as well. So, and now I'm going to turn it over to Brian.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Brian Iammartino, the faculty at the Harvard Kennedy School. I teach government budgeting, accounting, finance, specifically focused on urban development, urban policy, city management, and I also run a commercial real estate investment and development firm here in Boston. So I'd like to think those 2 hats. I do my best to have them be complementary and bring some of my teaching into the private sector and some of my real estate work into my teaching. And so I'm going to kind of build on what Chris was just saying and talk about broader based zoning reforms, as well as permitting, like building code type issues, and then general cost to build concepts that can also increase increase the supply of housing. So on the zoning front, one of the things I've done quite a bit of work on the last couple years is a topic called inclusionary zoning. If you're not familiar with that, it's the idea that if you're going to build new housing, build 100 new apartment buildings, 100 new apartment units within an apartment building, do any of those have to be affordable? Inclusionary zoning would say, yes, you're mandated, you have to build, of those 100, 20%, 10%, 15%, 5%, 0%, 50% must be affordable. What does affordable mean? Well, this gets into these trade-offs. Well, it's defined as part of area median income, AMI. So 20% of those units are affordable to 80% of AMI, or do you want a lower number of affordable units, but more deeply affordable to 60% of AMI, to 50% of AMI. And so the research we've done, and I'm not going to try to summarize, I guess I am going to try to summarize 2.5 years worth into about 2 or 3 sentences, is, there are these trade-offs, and you need to, what I helped the students do in particular was look at it from a developer's perspective and say, the big push against inclusionary zoning is that, well, developers just not going to develop. They're not going to build. It's not going to be economically profitable anymore. So if you make me build 10% of my units, it's 60% of AMI, that's going to be such a low rent, I'm just not going to build at all. So what we've looked at is kind of looking at these different levers and looking at these trade-offs, trying to think about not necessarily propose what's the exact right mix, but help policymakers. It's a white paper to help policymakers specifically. It's meant for city-level policymakers to think about, what do I need to think about? What are the trade-offs? These trade-offs in particular, and then also what we call sweeteners. So if you do enact inclusionary zoning, how can you make a developer more inclined to build? Say, oh, I don't want to do this, now it's not profitable. Well, give you a density bonus. So FARs, floor area ratio. So instead of building 10 units, now you can build 12 units if you agree to this inclusionary zoning. Density, then from developer's perspective, the more dense, usually the more efficient you can build and the more profitable it is. So you have these offsets. Reduced minimum parking is a big one these days, particularly here in Massachusetts at least. Boston, Cambridge has gone down to 0 minimum parking. Parking is really expensive to build, and it's sort of unprofitable. Even when you think about parking rates, say here in Boston, it's still not very profitable. So these trade-offs. So all right, the more you're going to push the developer on the inclusionary zoning side, let's give them some sweeteners. Let's say we can reduce, you don't have to provide as many parking spaces. You can have more density. Now I would also argue, putting aside inclusionary zoning, those are very good reforms in and of themselves. And you just heard from Chris how hard it can be to enact any zoning reform, particularly here in Massachusetts where it's all these different municipalities all control it. But increased density, reducing parking are 2 sort of tried and true ways to make housing more affordable. Other things going on right now, so in the news a lot, so accessory dwelling units, ADUs, sometimes called like granny flats. So this promotes aging in place. If you have a household, they already own the house, they already own the land. So if you can build a little bit more house, that's a little bit more housing supply. That's somebody who can now age in place and live in a home that now opens up a home for somebody else. Chris mentioned Minneapolis. That's eliminating single-family zoning. They went ahead and said, okay, nowhere does it have to be, if you have a plot of land, it doesn't have to be single-family zoning. That's what zoning is. It tells you, it's land use regulation, what you have to do with your land. Now, eliminating single-family zoning, therefore, said, well, okay, I have this plot of land, I can build a duplex. I can build a side-by-side townhouse. Maybe I can build 4 units on there. It's also a very good example. So Minneapolis, for a while was like, oh, they eliminated single-family zoning and it didn't promote new housing, blah, blah, blah. This stuff takes time. It is starting to happen now. Minneapolis is seeing this start to have an impact and lead to more housing. It took some time. So all of this stuff, it takes time to enact, and then it takes time to filter through. Minimum lot sizes. So I was just asked to help out. Let's look into a project in Windsor, Vermont. The minimum lot size to build a single-family home in Windsor, Vermont is like 5 to 10 acres. So that to me is mind-boggling. Now, I being a Bostonian, but surprise, and even Windsor, Vermont has an affordable housing crisis. So can we reduce that to, even an acre? And with the point being, in my opinion, and this would not be the sort of NIMBY approach, but as of right, that as a pro-supply academic and also as a developer who wants to build, as much as you can build as of right makes it easier, faster, quicker to build and increase the supply. So that's on the zoning side. I'll just quickly go over permitting and then cost to build. So before I get myself in trouble, is anyone from Houston here? Okay, and I don't think I'm getting in trouble, but so Houston, so I pulled this, it says right there at the bottom, the lack of zoning laws in Houston means pretty much anything goes in the city's design. That's not really true kind of at all. Because, permitting, to the rescue, building codes, health codes, historic commissions, conservation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Houston has no zoning. And I should say, I took that picture from like the top 15 things you need to know if you're moving to Houston. It's like root for the Astros, and it's really hot, and also that picture. So no disrespect to those folks, but it's really not true. So Houston has no zoning. It doesn't really mean you can build whatever you want. The fire department, we can go back and I can illustrate these rather than make you read a slide. I can just look at that right there. The fire department is going to want to know about the sprinklers and fire alarms, smoke detectors. They're going to want to know, can they pull a fire truck up? And the taller the building, the more fire trucks they need to pull up, and the more the water pressure needs to be to reach up, connecting to the sanitary line. That's the engineering department. Is the thing going to stand up? That's structural engineering. That's the building department. So just because there's no zoning, so to take the extreme case of eliminate zoning entirely, which I do support, doesn't mean you can build whatever you want. You still have to go through all sorts of different codes, ADA, accessibility codes. So how can we make that better? That's actually research I just started last spring, which is, so there's sequential permitting versus parallel. So imagine all these different departments. The way it works a lot in Massachusetts is you go to one, and then they take 10 days, and you go to the next one, and you go to the next one. That's called sequential permitting. So how about just plop, put them all, and let them all go at the same time? That kind of leads to coordination between the parties, and then communicating out. Some of this stuff is so arcane. I mean, I happen to be lucky to own a single-family home in Boston. We're looking into an ADU. I'm a professor at Harvard, and I'm a real estate developer. I don't really know how I would go about doing that. It's complicated, it's hard. So Mayor Wu here in Boston has done a very nice job of trying to just be more informative, communicative to citizens to help understand all this permitting. Putting aside zoning, even if it's completely as of right, you still need to follow you still need to have the right safety entrances and exits. So last but not least, so the cost to build. So as Mark Twain is supposed to have said, buy land, they're not making more of it. Those of us in Boston know that's really not true at all. Most of Boston is actually on infill, reclaimed land. But land is often, in dense areas like cities, one of the most expensive parts of building. It's just getting the land. So there are nonprofits, community land trusts. I should say, I know I'm talking quickly, I'm just trying to get through this. I've done a bit on all of these things, so I'd be happy to talk more or answer questions afterwards. Community land trusts is land that ends up owned by nonprofits, can be deed restricted forever. So now if you have cheaper access to the land, so therefore less expensive housing. Right now, a big government-owned land, so you have underutilized properties, vacant parcels, give them away. Often ground leases, so you're not selling it, but you're ground leasing the land for 99 years for, say, $1. Well, now you have cheaper access to land, you can build cheaper housing. And last but not least, and I'll go over these, the least quickly, well, we can just go to this one. Let's talk about, there are cheaper ways right now to build stuff. There's timber, there's wood-framed houses, timber, mass timber, there's new concrete technology, believe it or not. So how are these all coming together? Well, office to residential, and that's in the news a lot lately. I talked about zoning, permitting, cost to build. Zoning, so cities are trying to incentivize office to residential by saying, well, it's not allowed in zoning right now, but if you do it in the financial district, we'll let you do it. Zoning, loosening zoning. permitting. That's kind of been more of like a, we'll make it easier for you. It'll be streamlined, is the word you hear a lot. It's faster, coordinated. To which I say, great, just always do that, you know, and don't just wait for office to residential conversions. And then cost to build, it is extraordinarily expensive, so government subsidies are coming in. And Boston just announced a very sort of aggressive tax incentive to incentivize developers to get the cost side, basically saying, look, we know this is going to be real expensive, so we'll help subsidize that to try to incentivize developers to do it. So happy to talk more, looking forward to talking more, and I'm sorry if I've gone over my time, but now I'll hand it over to, I guess, Leah. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think what Brian was just saying and what resonates with me is that it's complicated. And there's a lot of work that we have to do in order to get that streamlined. And one of the things that Brian mentioned is about the permitting. A lot of times in the smaller communities and even in the cities, the permitting process is really around a small number of folks get to decide. So if there's a yes or a no, it's just a couple of folks that can decide whether or not something's going to pass, which can also impact the ability to get some of the things through too. So I'm going to turn it over to Shawn now.
All right. Utah, I'm going to talk about Utah. So talk about some surveys that we've done in the state. Our quality of life survey, which is one of our signature products, and then this middle housing study that we've done. And then I'll talk a little bit about solutions that came out of that middle housing study and a report that we've started working on related to that one of our staff members is doing related to home ownership. And so I'll talk a little bit about a few of the things coming out of that. In fact, one thing that I think is the coolest thing that if you haven't heard about it or if you don't have anybody doing it, look into it. It's freaking awesome. So quality of life, 2002. So in 2022. In 2022, Utah's quality of life, for community quality of life metric that we've been doing, this is the 5th iteration of it, it decreased. And affordable housing, it's got the lowest performance rating on that index by far. Housing affordability does. And the decrease, 2/3 of the decrease from 2018 to 2022, they're from housing affordability and other costs of living. So costs are dragging us down, at least in Utah, in terms of our overall quality of life. We had a question, open-ended questions. What's the thing that can most improve your area as a place to live? The plurality of respondents suggested having more affordable housing. So after this, it was like most of the other items were like, most of the next 10 items were like in the 10% area. And you could answer more than one thing. But most people, like, it was a lot of stuff about traffic and like if we had better looking communities and better sidewalks, that sort of thing. But affordable housing came out on top. So in terms of our middle housing study, we, so middle housing, who's familiar with the term missing middle? Several of you. So in Utah, before we did this study, nobody was talking about missing middle housing. Like nobody anywhere. It wasn't part of our lexicon at all. We've been talking about it. It's these duplexes, it's triplexes, it's small apartments, it's cottage courts, that sort of thing. So we're finally talking about this, and it's not just the Utah Foundation, but I would like to think that it's mostly the Utah Foundation, that we're talking about this. We asked some folks as part of a survey for that project about affordability, and most survey respondents don't think they could afford the house they live in now if they were to buy it today. These are homeowners. Most people don't think they could buy the house that they're currently living in. And nearly 90% of people are worried about housing costs. And they're not, most people aren't worried about their own housing costs. They're worried about people's housing costs, lower income people in general. They're worried about younger Utahns. And mostly, they're worried about their own kids. So they were like, my kid is not going to live in the state. They're like, how is my kid going to live in the state, given that where home costs are? I'm sure like in the Boston and Worcester areas and in most of your communities around the nation, you probably find the same thing. It's like, I don't know where the kids are going to live. In terms of preferences, most people, most respondents want more affordable housing in their neighborhoods, but they don't want apartments. Just let's get more affordable housing, but make sure it's not, and more housing affordability, but make sure they're not apartments. In Salt Lake County, the plurality of development right now, it's apartments. Like we're building apartments. We're also, there's still a little bit of single family that's being built. There's also not a lot of land left in Salt Lake County, so that it's a little bit tricky. Like a lot of stuff that's happening is infill, and particularly in the bigger cities. So that is what people don't want. What people do want, we had this pretty cool thing before where we've never done this, where we show a bunch of pictures and ask people about what they kind of like and what they don't like. What people want, they want homes that look like single-family homes. This is not a single-family development right here. There's a whole ton of these in this area called Daybreak in Salt Lake County. These are triplexes. You can see one of the little doors on the right here. They look like kind of like I think relatively good-looking McMansion-y type things, but there is a little bit more density than meets the eye on this, and this is what the people are after. This is kind of cool. I just found this picture this week, actually. This rendering. These are a couple little single-family homes that a development is putting to work, and then they're sticking a couple duplexes in the back. They're putting a duplex in the back of each of them, so that you've got some. This is like a cottage court, but it's like a hidden cottage. It's like a tricky cottage court. It's not really a cottage court, and this is like just a little picture of the single family in the front, and then the duplex that's in the back. So there are some things that maybe we can kind of explore, that we can give people what they want in terms of appearance. I only want to live in a single family community neighborhood, and it's like, well, or maybe if we hide the duplexes, and if we hide the fact that this is a triplex, then maybe that's more acceptable. So some of the obstacles we talked about in that report: zoning. We talked about zoning, parking requirements, condos. Has anybody looked into condos at all? Like why isn't condos in Utah? Condos are not being developed anymore. Like so few developments are condos. And there's a whole host of different things. So we looked into the reason why that is. When looking at condos and townhomes per square foot, they're actually more expensive than single family. That's what we found in Utah, but they're smaller, which means they're less expensive. Even when you take into account extra fees, they're less expensive than the single family developments that they're near. And then neighborhood opposition. We talk a lot about neighborhood opposition in this report. So some of the solutions we talked about upzoning like in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, and overlay zones. These are essentially, these transit zones are kind of overlay zones. Is that right? So these overlay zones to make things happen. And then form-based code. Like appearance is key. Again, we talked a lot about form-based code because it's like, as long as this looks this is kind of cool, put whatever you want there. Like you can, if this is going to, if you can have a business in this space, or if you want to put a 700 square foot apartment in the space, whatever, or condoize, or whatever the heck, whatever you want to do, as long as people have a little bit of say in what that form-based code looks like, and then you develop along those parameters, it's a little bit more acceptable. We found. And I put this slide up just to tout like the Utah Foundation. We have so few real wins, real tangible wins. But we did in 2022. This is like a week after the fourth report came out of the series. We got some language into code that basically like municipalities get a menu of options that they have to choose from, that they get to choose from around their moderate income housing plans, and one of those is this thing around middle housing. So that's we felt that was kind of exciting. So the little things are happening in this respect. And then lastly, so we have there we go, homeownership. So this homeownership report, we're talking more about zoning, we're talking more about condos, we're talking about addressing investments, we're talking both like in terms of Airbnb stuff, but also institutional buyers. We've got developers that are putting in, they're putting in 50 units in a community, and it's like, oh, institutional buyer comes in, buys all of that stuff at once, and then rents those things out. So you're losing. We need all housing stock. Utah is down. We were down 50,000 units in terms of housing for the state. We got down to about 30,000 units short, but now there's been a slowdown again in permitting, and so we're going to be probably back shortly up to that 50,000 shortfall again. So basically that means like kids living in your basement and whatnot in the state and doubling up and whatnot. So we're talking about investments and then purchase support. This last one is in terms of purchase support. There we go. Perpetual housing. So we got this is the cool thing, and this is my last slide, and I'm so excited about it. In Utah, we've got an organization that's doing some development, and as part of that, they've started this kind of structure where renters have an income sharing kind of stake in the development that they're living in, and an equity sharing kind of stake in the development they're living in. So I'm going in and I'm spending my $1,500 a month on rent. Once the costs are paid off that are related to this unit, the check each month, you get a check each month that is equal to 75% of all of the revenue that development has made that month. So this is from the first month that you're moving into this unit. So you're getting a major part of the chunk, and that's 75% of, we're all in this apartment together. My unit is maybe one of 10 units, so I get 7.5% or whatever of the profit from this development. When I move, there's a fund that's run by a former senator that got some funding from the legislature. When I move out of that unit, the Rocky Mountain Homes Fund is going to provide me with my equity share. So this is, after a year, you're going to be able to look and see if that building has increased in value over a year, or if I lived there 2 years or 3 years, whatever, I think like once a year or whatever the schedule is for assessing value. I'm going to get a check that I can then use to put as down payment on a house, or just to like go to Vegas or whatever, like take a trip around the world or whatever the case may be. And this is has anybody heard anything about this anywhere? I think it's the man that is doing this and his organization is it's kind of like Mother Teresa, I think, is part of why this is happening. But also it's just a cool thing. We're going to be writing a lot about it in a report that's going to come out in a few months. So you take a look at that, but you can also just look it up. I mean, there's some news and stuff on this. It's pretty amazing. And I think that's my last slide. Pretty sure. Oh yeah, so people are concerned about housing. It's decreasing quality of life. Middle housing is one way to maybe address some of those challenges, especially with infill and whatnot. It's also a way to address some home ownership stuff. I mean, there's some cool opportunities for home ownership around middle housing. And then there are some home ownership policies that can help, and that's what this news report of the Utah Foundation is doing, is kind of looking at those. Anyway, thanks.
Thank you, Shawn. So we're going to have Jeff come up and speak a little bit. And what most of you probably know is that affordable housing is racial justice. The folks who are impacted by affordable housing are disproportionately people of color. And so Jeff's going to talk a little bit about his work around that.
Thanks. Howdy. So I'll start by saying a couple things. So I come at this from a different perspective than affordable housing. In some ways, in Philadelphia, our biggest problem is that we have too much low-value housing, or a very bifurcated housing market, let's say. Just for example, we've had a huge building boom in the last 20 years. In my neighborhood, which has grown from 2,000 people in 1990 to 12,000 people in 2020, I have 7,000 units, apartment units under construction right now. There was a time when that was considered a lot for the city. That's just one neighborhood now. So it's been this massive building boom, but those apartments are running for $3,000 to $5,000 a month. So we're approaching like Brooklyn level housing prices. How many here are familiar with the work of Andre Perry? He wrote this amazing book called Know Your Price, which is focused on one of the key pillars of the racial wealth gap, which is the destruction of property values for people of color in this country, in many, if not most places. Perry focused on black majority cities. Philadelphia is not a black majority city, but we are a BIPOC majority city. So we decided to tackle this question of what neighborhoods have seen property value growth and which ones have seen property value decline. And it was really to test a hypothesis that we jokingly call the Jeff hypothesis in my shop, which is that devaluation of property is a far, far, far bigger problem than anything we could legitimately call gentrification in Philadelphia. We haven't had much displacement through gentrification in Philadelphia. We still have about a 23% poverty rate, mostly because we haven't gentrified our poor people out. We've had steady population growth in the last 20 years, but we're still about 300,000 people short of our 1950 population high. Although on a neighborhood by neighborhood level, like my neighborhood's population has already exceeded 1950 levels, but we have a huge number of neighborhoods that have kind of emptied out, and we've had a lot of growth in about 30% of neighborhoods, and shockingly, that maps onto property values. So we got a really massive data set, all of Philadelphia's property sales records from 1950 to the present. We normalized it, and we analyzed it, and I'll talk a little bit about our preliminary findings, because the study's not done yet, but when we were talking about this panel, I just thought that the trajectory here is from homelessness to home ownership. A couple other things I'll mention in Philadelphia. We have about 400,000 housing units in the city of Philadelphia, 600,000 parcels of land. And unlike Boston, we don't have much places to infill. Philadelphia has not grown a centimeter since 1854. So, when we had our municipal consolidation about 50 years before New York did theirs. So we've had the same number of parcels for a very long time. We have about 55% home ownership, which is, low compared to the country, but very high compared to most major cities. But the interesting thing is about 40% of our homeowners are low income. So a lot of intergenerational property transfer, but not a lot of intergenerational wealth transfer, which we have seen. Our city has 12,000 people per square mile, but that varies dramatically by neighborhood. But it's still, very high by national standards. And one other thing I'll say before I move on to the next slide is that much of our property product growth is attributable. I was listening to Brian talk about Boston's new plan for 75% tax abatement over 29 years. We've had a 10-year tax abatement, 100% tax abatement for the last 30 years, and it's been dramatically successful in creating what some might call a normal real estate market, and now we're phasing that out. So we have the opportunity to use more targeted tax incentives to incent different sorts of housing. So, but this is all to say that we haven't produced much in the way of equity in either sense of the term, like fairness or property value appreciation. So this is the key points here, right? Structural racism, the place where the rubber really hits the road is in the real estate market, right? When we talk about structural racism, that is the most impactful piece of it, right? The 70% or so of the racial wealth gap is because white people's homes are worth a lot more than black and brown people's homes. And, we know the factors: redlining, bias in the mortgage lending system, prejudice, and contemporary assessment practices. So we've done a lot of work in Philadelphia around assessment reform. And then what are the downstream effects of that, right? If you have devalued property, the inequities are cascading, right? Public education funding in our very silly way that we fund education, it's based on property values, libraries, parks, public safety, other neighborhood amenities, and the more individual paths to wealth accrual, like being able to leverage your home to start a business or to pass that wealth on to the next generation. So next slide, please. Actually, can we flip to the last slide first? I think I put them in the wrong order. So this is just a preliminary graph. And you can see the top line is white property appreciation since 1950, indexed. And don't pay attention to the dollar signs. I think they're not. But the main point is the gap, right? White property values are hugely appreciated, especially since the 90s, relative to everyone else. It's hard to do this because the demographics of the city have changed a fair amount since 1950. I mean, Philly was a largely white city in 1950, and now it is a 65% BIPOC city. But the key findings, if you can go back to that other slide, the third slide, is that in 2022, homes in Philadelphia's majority black neighborhoods were valued $22,000 less than the average home value. In white neighborhoods, Latino households, $28,000 less than the average home value. And we're talking about average home values about $200,000. It's a pretty significant difference. And the cumulative devaluation over time is, rough order of magnitude, close to $1 million per home. So, we're going to hone this down and more finely grain it, but really come up with a price tag for what I'm not supposed to say is something like reparations. Because that's really, if we can attack this problem, so we're going to be using this report and the data that we've generated to run a housing equity challenge. One of the things we do at the Economy League is we have what we call an impact lab social innovation platform that we use to run challenges. So we've been running a health equity challenge funded by Blue Cross to identify community-driven solutions to health equity problems. But we're trying to raise money now for a housing equity challenge in 2024 that will source community-driven solutions to revaluing property in neighborhoods where it has been, devalued. And so far, it looks like devaluations happen in about 60% of neighborhoods. So the inequities are humongous. I mean, my house doubled in value in 15 years, and for those of you who don't know, I used to be a union organizer and represented janitors, and the black women I used to represent, their houses have declined in real value for the most part in the last 30 years. So it's a huge problem. Policy got us there. Policy needs to get us out of there. And so we're going to be working hard to put together some racial justice funding to revalue neighborhoods, right? Because it's not just a house. It can't just give you 50 grand to put on a new roof and improve your heating and cooling systems, but if you're in a neighborhood that no one wants to live in, your property values are not going to go up. So my solution to most of this is we need a targeted and controlled form of gentrification, because we're focusing on the wrong stuff for the most part. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you all. Really appreciate all of that. So I wanted to take a little bit of time. I have a couple of questions, but really wanted to make sure that folks in the audience here have a chance to ask questions if you'd like. And I don't know if we have a microphone or. Okay.
So one of the reasons that we took 200 Philadelphians to Detroit last year, and thank you, Eric, and your team for aiding us in being able to go deep. It's another one of the things we do is bring Philadelphians to other cities so we can learn something. And Detroit for us is the limiting case, right? Detroit and Philadelphia both had roughly 2 million people in 1950. Detroit has 700,000, plus or minus. Philadelphia has 1.6 million. So we lost a lot of people and then we gained. Detroit has been steadily declining. One of the things we learned from Detroit, A, is that your civic infrastructure is unbelievably strong. right? To get out of bankruptcy in less than 10 years, unbelievable. It took us 25 with a much different strategy. But from the housing point of view and from the neighborhood point of view, like I feel the pain of the mayors of Detroit, right? Detroit and Philadelphia are exactly the same size, 135 square miles. We have huge density. It is a little bit disparate, but we can amortize the costs or socialize the costs of services over a lot of people, right? When you have neighborhoods that have almost no people in them, like the cost of providing fire, police, all the basic services is astronomical on a per household basis. So either you have to raise taxes, which is what we did when our population declined, and that forced more people out, so it was this vicious cycle, or you have to consolidate neighborhoods. So what we did in Philadelphia in the 2000s, we did something called Neighborhood Transformation Initiative. We floated a $400 million bond, and we went to neighborhoods and blocks where there were maybe 2 or 3 homes standing out of 30, bought people out, put them somewhere else, and then leveled that entire block and packaged it for redevelopment. Those were called NTI lots. We have almost none of them left. It's been wildly successful. Mayor Duggan in Detroit has been trying to get, my understanding, trying to get that passed through the Detroit City Council, and they won't. And a lot of it has to do with this neighborhood character question, which to me is like a bullshit argument, right? Like, people are like, what about the historic residents of this neighborhood? I'm like, well, my grandfather, see the synagogue the Baptist church I'm standing in front of, you see that Jewish star behind the cross? The character of this neighborhood used to be all Jewish, now it's not, right? So like, the only thing that's constant about cities is change. But there's like a leadership vacuum when you can't persuade people. But what Detroit needs, in my view, is like a massive NTI project to consolidate people geographically so that you can provide those services efficiently.
It is, so if you look at Salt Lake City, for example, kind of that neighborhood character, one of the things you're seeing with infill there, it isn't high density. It's 3,500 square foot ultra modern home in a community that is surrounded by 1,800 square foot homes built in 1940. So that, I mean, that's part of the concern is that, but sometimes it works, and sometimes I think it's like, I want to freaking live there if I can afford that place. But in terms of making it affordable, if you look at, and this changes the character too of a community, but if you've got a lot that's maybe 0.15 acre, and instead of putting a single family unit on it, maybe you put in 2 units, or maybe do a small multifamily thing that has some of the design characteristics that fit with the community, then I mean, again, as I just showed in I didn't really get into this too much, but appearance is the key, and as long as it's not a big ultra modern thing, and as long as it has there's maybe an entrance on the front, and the other 2 entrances are on the side, people are more fine with that than not. And most people, like in our service, it's like, we need more affordable housing, and we totally need more in our community. Just not on this block, but the next block over, it's totally fine. But middle housing, is if you do some of that, and if that's a lot more acceptable on that next block over than apartments. And even if it's small, and if it's small, it can still pencil, according to there's an organization that's doing some smaller units in that infill kind of area, and they make it work. Maybe they would make more money if they did that $3,500, $1.8 million home, but 35,000 square feet, $1.8 million home. But some of that other stuff, it works as well, particularly if it, yeah, I don't know. I don't know the answer, but.
I would just say, is this on? Can you guys hear me? Is that, oh, there we go. I would just say sometimes the phrase community character is often really, it's code speak for other people, like not like me, that don't look like me. That may be the case in an all-black neighborhood, it may be the case in a mixed neighborhood, but it is often just, code speak of people who testify at hearings that say, this just is not okay for me. And if you're interested in that topic about testifying in hearings, there's a book called Neighborhood Defenders by some BU professors, Catherine Einstein, et cetera. So anyway, if you're interested in that approach. The other thing that I would suggest, because Jeff's comparison about what happened in Philadelphia is probably the most applicable. Massachusetts, we have a program where the state puts money into something, and if you do a certain level of density, and potentially even think about deed restricting homes for size, but you have to have some public money in it to make it right for the development community. But that's another tool that I have seen is instead of just deed restricting for affordability, you deed restrict for size, and you say, okay, this house is going to be a 1,850 square foot house, and and a garage, and that's what you get, and you can't really make it bigger, and that will keep the price down, and somebody who buys that house agrees to be deed restricted, but you need to have some public money in that. So there's a program in Massachusetts like that.
We zone whole neighborhoods like that.
Yeah, right. It's a zoning in Massachusetts. It's a zoning district called a starter home zoning district.
So, I'll just add just from, so the things that we cite at Central Mass Housing Alliance are probably the most difficult, which is usually multifamily for persons experiencing homelessness. And the two things that we always hear are it's going to impact the character of the neighborhood and traffic. So those are the two, and it's the two things that prevent affordable housing from moving in. We have one community that is adjacent to Worcester right now, where there was a citizen's petition for a moratorium on affordable housing for 18 months until they can do a study on what the impact on the character of the neighborhood is and the traffic. There's also a neighboring town with one of the MBTA communities that is just saying they don't want multifamily housing. It doesn't meet their town. And so they're actually not putting in a plan at this point in time. So those are just two things to think about when we talk about the character. I will also say that we're also working with some of the smaller communities to think about what kinds of programs for those experiencing homelessness would work. So the town that I was mentioning to you that doesn't have a large population, a 50-bed shelter is not going to work. But a 6-bed or something that we can do a little bit smaller may work. And so really engaging the community, and they've been fantastic in working with us and trying to figure this out. So, right. Go ahead.
So you start with a goal of just getting more housing units of any type. Obviously zoning is sort of like the big obvious one. I'm curious what each of you would say is the highest impact leverage point that state and local lawmakers have that they least understand. So parking minimums, floor area ratios, building codes.
I'll start. I did talk about data and the MBTA communities, and one of the things, and so the website is on the slideshow, so if you're really interested in this, please go to the website and you can learn more about it. We are asking communities to actually do a zoning capacity analysis of their district. They have to actually meet certain targets of units, and each community has its own unit target, and they go through a process, and as far as I know, this is unique in the country, but they're putting in metrics from their zoning, and then that applies to all the parcels in the district, and that'll result in a unit capacity calculation. So it's kind of, it's a very fancy Excel workbook, but it needs input of the zoning metrics. And one of the things we did this on purpose, so we have height, density, and parking as the metrics, and the parking makes a huge difference. And so and it does assume surface parking, so it's, because again, we have 177 communities, we had to make some major assumptions. And so when you run that model, and if you have 2 parking spaces per unit as your base parking, which is kind of typical, not as typical for multifamily, but it might be where people start. And then if you reduce that to 1 or even less than 1, you'll see a huge difference in the unit capacity, and that's kind of on purpose. We wanted people, both the planning community and then the elected official community, and of course then the public, to understand if the results, if you have certain standards, it's going to really affect the capacity, because a developer has to accommodate a certain number of parking spaces on a lot. There are also some really great studies in Massachusetts about parking that are actual. Regional planning agencies have gone out and measured parking efficiency, and mostly, multifamily is all overparked, right? So they're being used at half of the capacity of the parking, and so those are helpful because it can then you can tell elected officials, who can tell the public, hey, we've looked at this and we don't need as much parking as we're asking for, and maybe you do have to walk a little bit further to get to your unit, but. The parking is not the issue. So that we're trying, we're kind of using that parking as one to really point that out to folks.
I would, I'm sort of an evangelist for this and trying to become more of one. So you said, zoning is sort of, is almost the low-hanging fruit. It's very hard to address, but I think a lot of cities these days, municipalities, state, local, are getting smart on zoning, parking, all that sort of thing. In my presentation I gave had zoning, then the permitting, building code, and then the cost to build. I think cost to build is also pretty, whether you're in Tampa or wherever you might be, the costs are the cost, and there's not a lot to do about that either in supply chain logistics. I really think as I've interacted with, this is where I can put on my developer hat and also my academic practitioner hat, as I've interacted as a developer within cities in sort of navigating permitting, building codes, all that. And then as I've just this past semester did a permitting project. It's not published yet or anything like that. It might be, but in a town here in Massachusetts. I think a lot of state and local government officials really don't understand, even if something's completely as of right zoning, everything, check every box and just go build it, what it takes to navigate the fire department, the smoke detectors, going through that whole checklist. It takes, time is money, to use a cliche. It takes time, it takes knowledge about the system. So language proficiency is a barrier in permitting. I mean, income, do you have time to go through this? Do you have time to go to community meetings? Just as simple as, well, I want to, fix my deck. Well, okay, there's building code about structural, there's fire department egress, stuff like that, I think, so as I said, so I see that firsthand as I go through permitting processes. It's inconsistent. You can go in one day and Lieutenant Smith from the fire department says X, and then the next day Lieutenant Jones says Y. It's inconsistent. It's not clear. It's not fast by any means. It's time consuming, and I think now as I've been even talking to more folks on it, I put on my Harvard hat and go in, and just this almost flabbergasted. The most recently, this project I just did in the spring, where the mayor was just floored that this is what it takes to build in his city, even if you solve all the zoning, historic, everything, or Conservation Commission, just really just to put a new roof on, just to fix my deck, like it takes all this. And so an understanding of that, and unfortunately, yes, we are fortunate in Massachusetts at a time where there's some funding in a lot of state and local governments, but building departments, inspectional services, those are types of things that tend to be pretty easily cut. And so then you hear the fire department says, well, yeah, I can't go more quickly because I lost all my staff, and I have one lieutenant going out and trying to inspect every restaurant and new porch and everything in the entire city. So it's a meaningful slowdown in the process and complication in the process that I think can have a big impact if somebody understands it better, and a strong leader who tackles that. It's also sort of a boring thing to talk about, I want to put my budget toward inspectional services, like, oh, great. So you need someone who's willing to kind of also champion that and make difficult decisions. I mean, I'm a city of Boston resident, so I see my kids go to Boston public schools. Like, I see those decisions have to be made. But just that, and I use the phrase permitting, but when I say that, I mean just a general dealing with codes, building regulations, historic, environmental, energy codes, whatever it might be.
Well, my colleagues are telling me we're out of time. So just on a last, just really quickly, what I would say, I think the other thing that we all need to do is to really think about how do we communicate who's eligible for affordable housing. And so there's a view of who's eligible, who's going to be in affordable housing. It's your college graduates right now who are living at home. It's seniors. It's your essential workers. And so how do we get that message out there as well? And so I think, I'm sure our panelists will be here for a few more minutes, and thank you very much for all of the information and answering questions. Appreciate it. Thank you so much for having us. It's a great topic.